sort of like bring you into how I do all this, I've got to first introduce Michelle, my wife. She's my co-pilot. Many of the pictures you'll be seeing are taken by her, so I have to acknowledge her first and foremost. From here on, we're going to be looking at plants that basically from across the continent, but focusing most heavily on the Far East Coast. And I'm going to include Australasia initially, because some of the islands around Australia are just as important. But anyway, a little bit of text just to warm up, but we in our industry, cactus and succulent collectors, we generally like weird and unusual plants, especially if we can grow them in the same conditions. Now, here's one of the most well-known and more widely available ant plants, or more correctly, ant house plant. We just shorten it to ant plants. But anyway, they're technically called myrmecophytes or myrmecodias, or basically the relationship with ants is primarily within the name of this group of plants. Now, this is something everyone likes the look of. It's just interesting and weird. It looks like a succulent. It's semi-succulent. It's got a name at the top there, Dischidia vidalii. But what a strange-looking plant. Nice flowers. They're rather small. They don't open barely at all. But you can see here there's this interesting growth. They look like, like a capsicum or a bell pepper. I don't know what you'd describe it to be like, but you know, have you ever wondered what's inside a capsicum or a bell pepper? Well, that's the inside. It's kind of hollow, but inside this thing, it's rather unusual because there's actually air that exchanges in and out through a hole. There's a cavity right here. So this is not like a bell pepper. It's not a sealed container. It's got an entranceway. Now, when dissected, now this is actually a leaf rather than a fruit or anything of that nature. It's a leaf that's formed in a way to have a hollow entrance here, and the roots along the stem, they not only come out to adhere to trees like a vine or to wrap around or to like an epiphyte climbing up. There's also roots that enter the cavity and go down to the bottom where there might be moisture collecting. So it's a great way where the plant can really utilize an internal area for moisture collection and basically as a xerophyte, this plant can moderate its water intake with that area within that strange looking leaf. Now, these are unusual plants because they've got two types of leaves. These leaves up top, and this larger leaf structure that has a hollow inside. And that hollow is very, very important because of a range of things, but rain can't naturally get in. So in tropical environments where these plants naturally grow, cyclones and storms can be so intense, the ground beneath them could be 1 meter or 2 meters deep, but up in the trees, if these plants can keep the water out of the holes, this area remains dry. Now, this sounds silly. The plant likes water, but there are roots already outside on the tree that can function when there's a flood. But then for several months, weeks or months, there's no moisture available anywhere, and the plant still wants to have continued growth. So then it relies on and utilizes these roots internally where there might be. Now, the water in here, if rain can't get in, how does water collect in the bottom? Well, that's fascinating because there's actually, I don't know if you can actually see in this image, but the shining on the right-hand side, for those with bigger screens, there's transpiration occurs and then it all, well, it's like a plastic bag in the sun on a hot sunny day. It sweats inside and it all accumulates at the bottom and these roots can utilize it. So it's a really smart, well, if plants could be in human terms, you'd call that smart. So anyway, now they produce two types of leaves, cordate leaves and bullate leaves. That's the term used to describe that large structure. Now, how does that evolve? These are the cordate leaves. They've got a pointed tip at the end, but you can see here, some of these have what appears to be a curling over effect. Now, the hollow in those leaves is not an internal leaf structure. It is, in fact, the back of a leaf, the bottom of a leaf that's just turned over, curled over. So you can see how that might develop here. But if that point were to turn right over, anyway, in this talk, we're going to start by introducing ant plants, this particular species. Then we're going to look at some orchids, and I'm going to go back to ant plants a little later on when it's, perhaps towards the later in the presentation. So it's going to zigzag a bit, the presentation, but eventually it'll hopefully distill very nicely. Now, if you look again, look at the right side, you'll see the moisture. It's quite obvious. That's all transpiration that's occurring during dry, hot summers when other plants aren't able to get moisture. This plant is able to moderate and maintain constant moisture for its roots. And of course, these roots in here can't go dry, so they stay always active. Isn't that just an amazing evolutionary? But, well, I haven't touched yet on the ants. There are ants that often move in and assist the plant in a range of ways. And of course, they coexist, the ants and the plant together. Fascinating. But what a plant. Anyway, now putting that to one side, that plant is not really Australian. These are the types of plants I mostly work with and research and write about, and they're from the arid regions of the continent. If Australia were to be fully assessed quickly, this is where most of the arid succulent plants come from. It's sandy, it's semi-arid to really desert. So, and most of my work is done here. On the right side, the east coast, we have a mountain range across here, and to the right of the mountain range, we have really wet, constantly wet climate, and it begins from semi-tropical down here up to very tropical up the top. So, it's and we're going to progress in the presentation with plants that are found here, going up towards and finishing at the top where all the ant plants are abundant. Anyway, firstly, now I'm going to leave ant plants, and we're going to look at some succulent orchids. Now, what do they have in common with other succulent plants? Well, here's one. I'm going to dispense with the name for a minute for an important reason, but this one looks very succulent. It's like, they call it the wheat-leaf orchid, and it looks a little bit like something we might be familiar with, but when dissecting these leaves, obviously you can see there's a high moisture content in there, and it's very succulent. So yeah, they would qualify to anyone's eye that that's a succulent plant. But, it could be argued that orchids can't be considered succulents. Well, some of Australia's most desirable succulents are in fact orchids. And I'm not going to read all this, but because it's on a good big screen on a wall, but it's not good for perhaps on your laptop or your mobile phone. Simply, some of these orchids that I'm going to be sharing with you, they use the CAM pathways. In other words, they actually they do their metabolism and transpiration during the night. So crassulation acid metabolism. They open their stomata at night so they can save moisture that is sometimes difficult to obtain. Anyway. Oh, sorry. Now, this is a typical succulent orchid growing on solid rock, and there's lichen all around. And here you've got one growing in a collection, and it's been tied onto a slab of rock. It'll grow on solid rock, needing no other surface on which to grow. It can be quite happy here. Interesting. There are plants we have in Australia, orchids and succulents, that are called geophytic, and that's basically ground dwelling. Bulbs are geophytes. Anything under the ground is a geophyte if it's a xerophyte. Anyway, then those plants that live in trees we well recognise as epiphytic, and those that live on rocks are recognised as lithophytic. And together, collectively, those plants we like, they're all xerophytic. Now, I'm going to just shortly for a while just touch on some geophytic orchids that we have. This is my favourite one. It's all the same species, got a name up top, Pyrorchis nigricans, and it grows one leaf, just one leaf. That's variation of the same species, growing just one leaf. Constantly, every year, one leaf will come up, no more, and no flower, just one leaf. One leaf, they're still the same species, but always one leaf repeating year after year. Just one leaf comes up, but no flower. For perhaps decades, same species again, one leaf. There are two plants here. And they can be quite large and very attractive, much like South African Musonias or Hamanthus perhaps. But why doesn't it flower? For perhaps decades. In national parks where we are in reserves, this plant hardly ever flowers, but it so happens after fire, oh goodness, after terrible, terrible forest fires, these national parks and reserves do eventually burn. When they do, now there's Pyrorchis on the left and there's one on the right, and it appears to have been burnt. Now, this may surprise you, but this is a good, healthy indicator when they're a little bit on the burnt side. Now, strange as it is, after a fire, the ground is often littered, covered with these plants popping up into flower. They seem to be stimulated by fire to such an extent that, it's just amazing. But its common name is fire orchid. After fire, these things just pop up everywhere. But you know what's most bizarre is at the bottom here, you can see the leaf and it's got a blackened edge. And some of these others have blackened flowers. In a burnt area, the trees are cleared and stripped of leaves, and many of them have totally perished. And yet now the sun reaches the ground below, warms the ground, and of course, with all the ash and food from it, these plants come forth and flower. So they respond well to a good burning. Now, the leaf at the back, again, blackened on the edges, it's more happy than those earlier ones I showed you that never flower. Blackening flowers and blackening eventually, the whole plant turns black after it's flowered. And it's strange because this hasn't been burnt. This plant's kind of adapted to fire to such an extent that quickly when the flowers been pollinated, the whole structure, the inflorescence turns black like charcoal. Yet if you lift the bracts, you'd find under there's an ovary and a green fruit hidden so that no predator should eat it. This plant's cryptic, it's hiding. Isn't it amazing? Pyrorchis nigricans, what a fascinating name. Pyro, that's like pyromaniac. Nigricans, nigri, that's like black. This plant is absolutely amazing, but it's a geophyte. Let's leave them to one side. Let's move on in a minute. But before I do, another quick thing. Bus tour groups can take you often to see some of these plants. Well, bus groups used to. Anyway, and when you get on the bus, behind every chair, there's a plastic bag. This is common on long-term bus trips, but long-distance trips. Interesting, these bags that you get given to help keep the bus clean, and also it's handy for you in case you need to be sick, but these bags are a great idea. Here I notice there's some wildflowers. I guess when you're looking out the window, you might want to, so it's educational. I like that too. Yeah, that's a good idea. My favourite of all is this one, orchid hotspots. Now, there's a list on the left of 6 different beautiful orchids photographed, and there's a map showing where to find all of them. And they're listed here with a name. What a fun thing to do. Well, sadly, I've actually seen people who have gotten off the bus and used this bag, and they've actually used the bag to not only find the orchids, but also use the bag to collect the orchids, all 6 of the orchids, like a goodie bag to take home. People just love doing this and exploring and collecting and gathering. It's just, I guess, it's what humans do. The sad part about it is if you go to these places now, all these hotspots, there are no orchids left. I don't know if it's a good idea anymore. So perhaps we shouldn't be sharing the locations of some of these rare plants with people. If we really want to help keep Australia beautiful, I guess it keeps humans out of these kinds of places because people can't help themselves. I mean, if you see a flower at a toilet stop or a picnic spot, if you see a flower that's really beautiful and you want to show it and share it with your friends, family, Facebook, you either photograph it or you pick it and put it in a vase at home and enjoy it a little. Well, I understand. Humans are like that. Now, we've looked at geophytes. I'm going to leave geophytes and now go into epiphytes and some of the other strange things, and also lithophytes. Now, as a lithophyte goes, this is Australia's biggest city in Sydney, and this is natural. It's not a Photoshop job. That's a natural sandstone rock face. And this happens to be the primary home of the Sydney rock orchid. And these rocks were once covered in orchids. I couldn't find any. I guess we're too close to humans and they've been picked over the years. I looked along at the coast. This is where its habitat is. And I looked to the left and I looked to the north of Sydney. along the coast. I travelled to so many places. I even went to the islands looking, and I barely found anything. Let me tell you, I covered every island, every location. I spent weeks looking and looking. Eventually, I found some high, out of reach. These are safe up here. There's a wonderful lithophytic. That's a rock face. There's no moisture there. These are actually adhering to the rock face. Here again, another one. And it's can you see on the screen there? I don't know why the bar's on the top. Can you all see the writing? Anyway, Stelachiton speciosum. It used to be called Dendrobium. Now it's up there on the top of the screen on the right-hand side on the rock face. And this I visited for several years, and it's about 30 feet up, so it's quite high up in the rock face. But I've gone back since it's gone. Many people now know how to rock climb really carefully and precariously up to reach. It's gone. Anyway, but gardens all around Sydney, all around Australia, most gardens, it wouldn't be hard to find them like this. So the gardens are full of them. There's probably millions of them in gardens. They're in gardens everywhere. But you'd be lucky to find anything like this ever in habitat anymore. It just doesn't exist. But I did find some barely alive, hanging on to cliff faces, still in remote places. I found ledges and places where it was in flower, the same species. Another xerophyte, a Dorianthes, that was what Gunnar spoke about. And there's other orchids and lithophytes here too. Now, this is a lovely little lithophyte. It's got a beautiful growth habit, again, in nooks and crannies on rocks. So this is a typical lithophyte growing on solid rock face amongst lichen, only sharing lichen in its habitat. So this is very out of reach. I'm using a telephoto lens to zoom in on this particular plant and how it grows on solid rock. So tough as nails, 2 species of lithophytic orchid. We'll have names in a minute. Now, there's Michelle. Hello, Michelle. Photographing, and I'm on an opposite side of the canyon. And when Michelle's photographing, she's using a tripod and she's being very careful. But I had to holler across to her from this little narrow canyon and tell her, because she keeps stepping back to get a better shot at focus at what she's looking at. And as she's stepping back, I didn't realize she couldn't see, but I could. Precarious, some of these locations, and we're quite high up in this canyon, so it's a bit hazardous. I guess that kept the plant safe from humans. But look at that. That does look desirable. Oh, it's got a name, Bulbophyllum shepherdii. The names have changed a lot. I hope not to trouble you with the botanical issue, the nomenclature. Problems. Beautiful. That does look desirable. I'd like that in a pot. It looks like it's going to fall anyway. No one will miss that. Maybe I should take it home. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. Human behaviour. Terror, disgusting. Anyway, look at that Docrelia. It's got a name. Look, when I was a child, I was with my parents in habitat, and my father was a pillager. Anything he saw in the wild was his. Finders keepers. I have never done that. This is not something I do. It's not something in my nature anymore. But nonetheless, I understand the human desire to seek out, hunt down, find, discover, and take ownership of what you've discovered. But anyway, look at this Docrelia. Now, there are several that look similar without confusing you. This one's got the name Docrelia nugentii, and it looks a bit like a Dromiscus from South Africa. There it is again too, Docrelia linguiformis growing again on rocks. I showed this earlier. Now, here's a strange-looking creature. What is it? Well, it's got a name, Bulbophyllum minutissimum, and it's rather interesting. It's got this really bulbous base, Bulbophyllum, good name, and what looks like a spiky little tiny leaf. Here's a colony. It looks a bit more like a conophytum. There's a colony of it tied onto something. Anyway, it's strange because this is a flower. And when it first flowered, someone else had a plant similar and its flower was different. Turns out there are 2 species of this tiny, tiny orchid. And it's got the name, the first one I showed, Bulbophyllum minutissimum. Let's look at the second word for a minute, minutissimum. That's like minute. Minute means small, very small. How small? Well, there's 2 colonies, 2 different species. These are large colonies. These are real. This is regarded as the smallest succulent plant in the world. Anyway, it is attractive. When it's growing in full water, it's quite an unusual looking thing. Oh, another one of my favourites, Docrelia cucumberina. And it looks like, see the second word, cucumber, a bit like cucumber. And they look like little gherkins, don't they? I can really see little gherkins in there. Anyway, there's Michelle's finger. Now, this is how people see and grow this plant. It's on a slab of wood, and everyone usually who tries this for the first time has difficulty understanding this problem. You see the stem is pointing up, the leaves are pointing up, it looks like it's growing up, but this is wrong. I'm going to now turn the picture anti-clockwise. We're now going to see what happens when we turn this left, anti-clockwise, yes, and we're going to turn it one more time. That's better. The stem is pointing down, the leaves are pointing down. This plant grows downwards, always, naturally. It's happy when it's growing downwards, not upwards. Remember, these are Australian orchids, and we're from the land down under. And that's kind of important because a lot of our orchids behave that this hangs upside down, exactly like this. It's flowering there. There's its flowers, the inflorescence, beautiful flower, Oreosorius behind in my cactus house. But look at the flowers. It's beautiful. But isn't it strange? What in habitat, growing on a tree trunk, and it's growing downwards. In fact, just to emphasize how it grows, it's come from up here and it's crept its way over the edge and down and down. So again, started here and it's creeping downwards. So that's its natural growth habit. Not like other epiphytes. You'd find epiphytes in the fork of a tree. No, not this species. It's under the branches, always growing down, always under. That's what it likes to do. Appreciating that, it will get you much further along at getting to grow the plant better. Another Docrelia, it's got rubbery leaves and stems, really rubbery. It feels like rubber when you touch it and give it likes rock face, coastal rock face and sea wind, salty conditions. It's really takes harsh conditions. And there are several subspecies or varieties, and they're closely related. This is one of them. There's its flowers, and there's another one with its flowers. The colours are different, striking they are. Now, this is it flowering, of course. And I saw an encyclopedia where the producers had gotten the flower and rotated it to be more appropriate for the reader. Now, I'm going to get this flower because it's an upside down flower, and I'm going to rotate it anti-clockwise. Once, twice. That's better. Now, that's how a flower most people recognize. There's petals, the outside petals, and this is the labellum, or the landing pad for insects and pollinators. The odd thing about this plant is that this is wrong because it's really naturally upside down. Remember, just like the other Docrelia, these plants like to grow a little bit different. So the flowers are going both ways in this case, but typically they do always hang upside down. Another Docrelia. These are really interesting because there are a lot of different species. I won't so much focus on the name, but here's a flower, and that's upside down. That's the tongue of the flower, and it is upside down. Anyway, if we, another one, now this Docrelia, there's a bit of colour variation in the flowers, but all the same species. It's again upside down. I'm going to, for the sake of the presentation, rotate this flower once, twice. That's better. There's the tongue. That's the landing pad for insects, pollinators, and so forth. And you can appreciate that's how flowers should look. I understand that, but here in Australia, it's not like that. These are upside down. Now, the leaves here are pointing to the top mostly. The flowers pointing up, the stem, everything's pointing up. That's wrong. That's not how you should be taking, showing photographs and sharing it, because really that's not natural. That is. The leaves are pointing down, the flowers are hanging down, and the flowers are upside down. Bizarre. Anyway, I'll say goodbye in a minute to this interesting species. What's that? Now, this, it's not wet. It's not wet at all. It looks wet. It's kind of shiny and shimmers in the light. It's got the name Sparkle Orchid, and it kind of sparkles. It's just so bizarre. So, no, it's not wet. It's a really strange. Now, the name of the plant is irrelevant. I just want to excite you with the diversity, because the names are having a lot of problems at the moment. The taxonomists are arguing to no end about some of these plants. So I really wish to avoid that for a very important reason. Anyway, now there's my hand, and there's a stick with two of these little succulent orchids growing, and they're so small. They take up so little space. It's kind of interesting because what they'll grow on here, that's foam, polystyrene, like styrene foam, isn't it interesting? Anyway, growing on bark, growing in a pot, growing in baskets hanging or on cork tied to a wall. These things take up very little space. And so if you've got a greenhouse, glass house, shade house, you've got often shortage of bench space. Well, growing plants vertically or higher above, this is a wonderful way of growing a larger collection without utilising or wasting space. Now, if I had no baskets and no bench space, let's say just a porch, just a pillar post like this one, I could actually have on this pillar post four sides, each side having a different environment. I could place and tie on these orchids and have a whole collection just on this one pillar. So growing plants vertically, very trendy at the moment, all around the world, utilising minimal space. So if you're an apartment dweller, you could have a whole collection of these orchids just on one pillar post, each side having a different microclimate, because of course, sunny side, shady side, etc. Oh, what fun. In my cactus house, this is growing hanging, not far from a lot of other plants, in the kitchen, growing on a slab of scoria. That's a lump of scoria, rock, solid rock, and it's growing and flowering. Anyway, there's money to be made in these plants. There are a few growers who are breeding and developing ones with really attractive flowers. A goldmine for sure. Anyway, I'm going to say goodbye to orchids in a second. There's one more here, but behind it, what's that? What's that behind the orchid? I can see something. It looks like a cordex. That looks interesting. Other succulent collectors will really love these. Now, the topic changes. Hopefully it'll all distill down towards the end, but let's now look at ant house plants or ant plants. We call them for short ant plants, but really they just house the ants. Anyway, there are, without too much focus on the text here, it's very small to read. There are 4 species of Myrmecodia above. They're in the family Rubiaceae, which is the same family that coffee, the coffee we drink. Oh, yes, actually, better have another sip. Now, there are 2 species here of Hydnophytum in Australia, also in the Rubiaceae family. And then there are 3 species of Asclepidaceae, which are now Apocynaceae, of course. So, these are the plants which are all quite distinct, Australian, and associate heavily with ants. Now, I'm now finishing with the East Coast, only focusing on the top north. There's a town of Cairns. I'm now going to proceed to Cairns and look at what we can find in this region, because this is where the most exciting plants we have are. Now, just north of Cairns, one of the Cairns beaches is called Palm Cove. And it's a resort town, small town, tiny, but beachside, there's cafes and hotels, and across the road, there's a beautiful beach and swimming. But here there are, and there are trees and palms, of course, lots of palm trees, but these trees are natural, the melaleucas that are native to the area, and they're tall, towering trees. And I'm told this is a place, this is where you'll find ant plants everywhere. Well, I couldn't find any. Well, understandably, over the last 100 years, they could have been picked off the trees or whatever. But anyway, I'm in a cafe here with Michelle somewhere. Oh, hello, Michelle. It's hot, lots to drink. And while sitting here, I had a pair of binoculars and a camera with a telephoto lens. And while enjoying the coffee, I couldn't get my mind off what could be found in the trees. So I kept looking up in the trees, high up in the canopy. And what could I find? Well, is that something? What's that on the lower left? There's a lump or something. I couldn't quite see. And there's other odd shapes and lumps high in the trees, but they're so high up, I could barely see with the sun behind. I thought, that could be one. but gee, I wish I could get closer. They're so far away, so out of reach. I guess they're safe from humans. Well, I really wanted to see them. And finally, I eventually found one that was not too far from my reach with a camera in my hand, but I didn't pick it off. But looking from the cafe, the water you can see, and on that tree, I went closer. Oh, I could nearly reach it. Now, zoomed in with the camera, it looked wonderful. I thought, oh, that's interesting. I decided I'm going to research these plants extensively. I went down every track I could find, every track and trail. I went to remote tracks and trails. I went everywhere, and I hardly found a thing. But I was persistent. I kept looking, and I decided I'm going to go into some swamps, and there were crocodiles here. Michelle wasn't too keen to follow me in, but I went in quite a way, and eventually Michelle followed it. And we finally ended up coming face to face with one. Oh, goodness, it was beautiful. And, I didn't have to use a telephoto lens. I was standing there. I could touch it, look at it. There's its name, Myrmecodia beccarii. And there's another one. And it's an epiphyte. It's not a parasite. It's not living off the tree. It's just holding on there. That's all. But I went back to this one year after year. It was still there. Oh, safe. Now, notice those stems. They're getting longer. Watch. Ooh, the same plant. I went back year after year. I found it just fascinating to observe and learn from them. One of the most odd things I found is those cavities in the stem, which are called alveoli, and those cavities are from where the fruit and flowers develop, and they repeatedly come from the same hole, which makes the hole get bigger and bigger. How unusual. And near the apex, there's fruit popping out. There's one here, and the hole gets bigger and bigger year after year. Now, there are ants that are all over the plants all the time, foraging and protecting, and there they are around the flowers, guarding them and picking off aphids and other pests and insects. So, the ants do a whole range of things, but their relationship with the plant is very, very detailed. And the stem of the plant's covered in spines, keeping other animals away. There are little holes, little tiny pinprick holes all over the plant. They're all vent holes. They're not holes the ants go in. At the base of the plant, right where it adjoins the tree, there is a larger hole. The ants use that. It's like a doorway into the internal section of the plant. When dissected, there are tunnels that go in every direction, tunnels and chambers, and the ants, I should be careful here, the ants are invited in. These tunnels weren't dug by the ants. The plant developed these holes, and through evolution, they've adapted to coexist and live with each other. And so this is really quite an advanced adaptation. But anyway, just to explain this, because it's a rather complex idea, these holes have different sections. Some parts are where the ants live, nest, and have eggs. Other parts are where they eat. And other parts, the darker parts, are where they deposit all their body parts, waste and dead bodies and food scraps. And so the plant's got all these different sections, specially designed, adapted for ant habitation. Anyway, what's this? That's from Africa. That's Dioscorea elephantitis. But, I wonder, how does any plant evolve to have a relationship so intricate with ants? I wonder about that all the time. And often I look for examples where it might occur with other plant genera or species. Now, I'm at Huntington Botanic Garden in California. There's a large elephant's foot or Dioscorea, and this large, giant, huge old plant, at its base, I found a small hole where there were black in the center, black hole, and there's bees going in and out. Well, they were nesting in there. I'd say there'd have to be a large cavity because bees need a lot of room to make honey, and there were thousands of bees going in and out. It must have been a very big cavity. But I thought, is this like an ant plant where a plant and an insect cohabits? Anyway, the relationship was interesting, but I looked at that cavity and I studied this plant in great detail for hours. On the other side, I found another smaller hole. There were also bees buzzing around, going in and out. So yes, there must have been a huge cavity under that huge Dioscorea. And I thought, that's interesting. Now, I thought, I'm going to test this theory out. I'm going to go and look for other Dioscorea, and I'm going to dig them up, and I'm going to check to see if they also have a cavity and what kind of cavity they might have, and so forth. So, I'm really into science, so experiments are necessary. I thought, I'll dig this old fella up that I had growing in the garden. I've dug up a whole bunch since. I've got about 30 or 40 of them, and I dug them all up, all different sizes, just to have a look underneath. Well, this example, I thought, let's get under there and let's see what we can find. Lifting it up, I indeed found a rather cavernous area in the centre that had uplifted. So the plant, as it grew on the edges of the perimeter, and it kept having a centre that rose like an internal area, a dry area so suitable, any plant that dug under would remain dry and safe from. Anyway, looking closer, I noticed why it looked like a mouldy fungus. I don't know what that was, but there was no damage to the plant at all. It was healthy. But looking closer, oh my goodness, there's actually ants and their eggs. My God, I found an ant's nest under there. Evolution at play, perhaps. Anyway, I now call this a pseudo ant plant. It was having a close relationship with the ants, and over time, perhaps this could evolve further. But nonetheless, I love this plant. Now, back to ant plants. This is Myrmecodia beccarii. Now, as an epiphyte, you would assume it would be perhaps in the fork of a tree, yet I never find them really in the forks of trees, not like orchids or tillandsias, other bromeliads. You'd assume it would start to grow here. It's nearly always, out from the fork. And there's another behind, but never in the fork. Why? Because I want to suggest the ants chose where the plant is positioned. So it's bizarre. Here too, we've got one that's not growing on the top. Perhaps the seed, a bird wiped its beak or bottom, or the seed landed on the top. No. I suggest, yes, I found an ant trail underneath. The ants decide more so where and how these plants grow. This is bizarre, this relationship. Here we have 3 seedling Myrmecodia, but to the right here, there's a tiny trail with ants. If I tapped it with my finger, I'd break the crust. There's a little like highway along here, and the ants chose where the seed was positioned along the stem of this branch. There's none on the other side. There's none on the top. The seed don't fall and land there. They're positioned on the side of ant travel routes. Now, there's an old ant plant, and here under this crusted, right here, there's an ant trail underneath. Now, this plant's getting old, and soon it's going to fall from the tree too heavy or perish there. I see a seedling's been planted next to it. Planted? Oh, that's a little bit over the top. Ants don't plant plants, do they? Well, I don't know. Here we have a tree in the back. There's no ant plants. Here we have a whole bunch of young ones, and again an ant trail. They follow ant trails. Just to emphasize how important this point is, this is a eucalyptus tree, a gum tree, a eucalyptus. And up it, if these plants after storm randomly are positioned in trees, I see no ant plants anywhere on the right side or on this branch, only on this line, the ant line. These plants are all positioned here, more so because of their relationship with ants than anything else. Now, ants don't throw food or scraps from the trees. That's an odd thing. You'd assume it would be smart that this plant would have the ants come out after a meal and throw the scraps over the top. Let it fall into the river and go to the ocean like plastic, because let it be someone else's problem. You know, ants are like that. They generally, all around the world, ants are known to take their food scraps and waste, take it out of the nest as far away as possible so as not to contaminate the nest, to stop bacteria, fungus, and so forth. It really can plague some ants. So ants are very careful about where they throw their waste and they often want to get rid of it. But with ant plants, something strange occurs because inside these tunnels and chambers, there are special chambers, the darker ones, where there are actually receptive plant parts that are highly absorbent of nitrogen. Now, ant plants live in an environment where these roots only just hold on. But in a tropical monsoonal environment, there can be storms with rain that occurs for days and weeks on end. And these storms and rainy conditions leach and wash all the nutrients from tree forks and from the ground. So the ground and all the mulch is leached of nutrients. So really, these plants are living in a starving environment where there's a nitrogen deficiency occurring. But inside the plant, if the ants bring food to the nest to share, after having eaten the food, all the scraps are positioned in a part of the plant where the plant naturally has the ability to absorb nitrogen. So it's just amazing, and other nutrients, of course, from the waste. That's just bizarre. So, now this is actually this section up the top. This is called the toilet, and all the scraps and food are jam-packed into these little sections. The ants are organized with the plant to do it in a these insects and plants recycle all their waste and utilize it. That's a wonderful relationship here. Anyway, look at that. You can barely see because I've zoomed in too much, but each of these sections in the plant have a very special function. Anyway, the ants are very protective of the nest or house, and so defend by swarming out to attack pests that might hurt or eat any part of the plant, except for this butterfly. Wonderful. It's called the Apollo jewel. I'm going to avoid its taxonomic name because there are several species, but Apollo jewel, there are several. Now, these butterflies, that's the front, that's the back. These butterflies lay the larvae on ant plants, and the larvae, the caterpillar, crawls into the tunnel underneath, lives there and hides and comes out at night and eats the leaves. Now, the ants won't kill it, because for some reason there's a pheromone or something that the larvae exude, and that the ants find it appealing. And the larvae also excrete something, a nectar-type substance that the ants actually love. So the ants inadvertently then will defend the plant and also defend the caterpillar from all other pests and birds and so forth. So, a wonderful, and the caterpillar can eat the plant without the ants being too bothered by it. Now, in the end, when the caterpillar pupates inside the ant plant, hiding with its chrysalid, butterfly collectors actually love this plant. And so, much sought after by collectors. To get a pristine specimen, see, these butterflies, they fly so fast. They're like lightning, and, in a breeding stage, they're often in battles, and, in the tropical after storms, they're often tattered and battered, and, butterfly collectors like a pristine specimen. Well, they discovered something about 100 years ago. They discovered that if you go around with a machete and around Cairns, there were millions of these plants all over the place, all the swamps. They'd go around with machetes and hack the ant plants that they could reach. They used to be down closer to the ground, hack them with a machete. On the ground, they'd hack them open looking for the larvae, and sometimes they'd find caterpillars at varying stages of development. And if they're lucky, after you've cut open a few hundred or a few thousand plants, they're abundant, so no problem. It didn't seem to bother, there was plenty of spare. You'd find occasionally the chrysalid, the pupae, and the pupae, butterfly collector would take it home, and that would be the prize of all prizes, because then you could hatch out a pristine specimen, kill it instantly, pin it onto your wall like a trophy. Now, they've been doing it for so many years that the government realised that the butterflies were disappearing all over Cairns, disappearing everywhere. Now the butterflies in the ant plants are protected by law. Wow, it took some extremes to bring that about. But you can't find the butterflies or the ant plants anywhere near civilization anymore. I wonder why. Anyway, now I'm at Cairns. I thought, I want to get to know ant plants better. There are other species, other ones more interesting up north, I'm told, up in the Cape York Peninsula. Now, going up here, I'm leaving civilization. I'm going into remote areas where the bitumen, the tar finishes, and the tracks go to trails, and you can get, anyway, there's lots of different species, as I said, several at least, of this particular Apollo jewel up there. Now, I want to head up there where there are a few roads, and, getting up there, there are lots of species undescribed, new things, but finding them in remote areas is not always easy. Even if you're finding them at head height, they could be hidden behind a tree. You could be standing there looking across, and it's almost looking you in the face. There's Michelle in the background. But eventually I did find plants, without spines. Is that a new species? And look at the stem. And bellows at the bottom. That looks nice. Oh, they look good. Oh. Now, it's wonderful to be able to get up close and personal with these things, especially where there are no other people to disturb you or bother you or to steal them, and you can revisit them. But now, heading up into this northern region, I decided to do some research, contacting all the experts. Roger Bedford, he's been up there. He knows all the species intimately. And also David Little here, giving us advice with maps, showing us all the detailed maps and all the things that he's found through his life. He works for a telecommunications tower network, so putting them in the remote regions. And he was an expert. He helped us. And off we went in four-wheel drives, a whole team of four-wheel drives. But this is an example of a crossing where the water was rather deep. We always had to step it out, and there's crocodiles. So, this was nice and safe. I took this one. It wasn't too bad, but I had my eyes up in the trees. If a crocodile came up behind me, Michelle was watching out. What's that? Ugh. Anyway, some of these river crossings were so deep, the vehicles nearly, I get washed downstream. Anyway, we had several vehicles, so we had backup. But anyway, and the remote tracks and places we went to were just extraordinary. We had to travel to such incredibly difficult places, but, it was really but worth it. Oh, we got lost so many times. We're hunting for places that, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. We were having fun. We went down every river and every stream looking up in the trees. I just couldn't get my eyes off the trees. I kept tripping over the rocks. Now, eventually we started finding them close to the ground. And there were by the way, while looking for ant plants, you walk into webs, and you often get this up near your face. There's a bit of a shock when you come across a spider or a spider's web, and you're not looking, you just walk right into them. Some of these things aren't small. Oh, gosh. Some of these things, I can tell you, it's the most unusual feeling in the world when you are looking up in the tree and looking for ant plants, and you walk into a web and there's suddenly one of these things on your face. The feeling is just overwhelming. I just can't describe it. Anyway, ant plants. Oh, they look nice. What are they? What species are we looking at? Well, here we have one called Myrmecodia tuberosa. It's got a very tuberous base. There's also some orchids. I see flowers up there, and Dischidia. Oh, look. Well, tuberosa, good tuberous, bulbous base. I like that. Now, here there are several species. We'll look in detail as to what they are, but they're different. They're different in a range of ways. This one's called Myrmecodia platytyrea. That's tuberosa down the bottom, thin stems, really thick stems with armor plating along the stems. That's Myrmecodia single stem. Interesting. Huge single stem. Oh, there's a second branch. Platytyrea, it's got like a plate-like scale along the stem and very thick. And there's spines around the edges of the plates often. So these plates, Platytyrea, very interesting. Myrmecodia platytyrea. Now, the petioles, the leaf stalk, leaf's been eaten. Oh, I can tell there perhaps could be an Apollo jewel larvae inside. Should I cut it open and have a look? No. Spines, very interesting. Anyway, that's again platytyrea. There's ridge lines on the cortex. Now, no spines. This is another genus. This is the genus Hydenophytum. Roger Bedford grew these 6 months, 1 year, 2 year. I think that's about 4 years here. So they're quite easy to grow in pots. Not difficult to grow. They don't need the ants. It's not critical. But there's its name, Hydenophytum mosellianum. Now, it's a beautiful plant and it seems to ooze around in the pot like it's just a wonderful cordyciform. Now, seeing them in a pot is one thing, easy to identify. In habitat, you can barely see them. There are two plants here, and these are as big as beach balls. But they're camouflaged so well, it took me a while to adjust my eyes to seeing them. They're just such a distorted monstrosity. Now, they have holes in the stems all over. It's a bit more primitive, not as evolved as Myrmecodia. Ants can enter at any point on the stem, and the whole network inside is not so complex. But anyway, on the left-hand side, there are two Myrmecodias, and on the right-hand side, there's a Hydnophytum. It's distinct. The two genera are easy to tell apart, but an ant trail. Yes, I can just see it wrapped around there. There's the ant trail right there. I can see there's a hidden ant trail. Oh, okay. Now, I took this picture because there's a Myrmecodia up here in the tree. When I got home, because I used a telephoto lens and the sun was in my eye, I took a photograph of the Myrmecodia. When I got home, I was really surprised to see and find there's a larger Hydnophytum here. This is as big as a beach ball, blackened on the top and a white outgrowth at the bottom. I thought that was rather bizarre that I didn't see it in the original taking of the picture. There's two Myrmecodias, one here, and they're stuck onto a Hydnophytum so they can live on top of each other. How bizarre. When you look for ant plants, you often find this Discidia too. So this is typical in an exposed, the tree's dead, so that's why it's so exposed. Discidia, another species. There are lots of species of Discidia that grow typically with Myrmecodias. So there's a Myrmecodia, Discidia. This particular one's called Discidia nummularia. It's got a common name. It's called the button orchid. It looks like an orchid, grows like an orchid, but no, it's not at all. And the leaves are very succulent. This is a really attractive little beady-looking plant, and when it's cascading or wrapped around certain trunks, it looks like an ornament, doesn't it? And I think that'd be ideal in a hanging basket. There are several species, but now in this picture frame, you're looking at genetic variation of just one species alone. This is Discidia ovata. And that's all the variation of one plant under different growing conditions. You can see the colour change occurring, but there are clearly distinct genetic variation within the species. These are two extremes of the one species in David Little's collection, growing on shade cloth. But those heart-shaped leaves are very appealing, aren't they? Oh, my favourite of all. Oh, this Discidia. Oh, Discidia major. Huge leaves, bullate leaves. For those who were not with the start of this talk, these have a hollow cavity and there's the flowers, tiny, barely open. Interesting, Discidia major. That's how these bullate leaves are positioned on the stem, opposing each other, and they have a small hole right where the leaves join the stem and enters in. There's a large cavity. But, you know, it's kind of odd because these are bullate leaves and these are what's called rather cordate or anyway, ovate leaves. These leaves here are quite distinct because these are typical plant leaves you'd see on any kind of plant. And these are not juvenile leaves. These are not adult leaves. Rather, this is one type of leaf. That's another type of leaf. It's called dimorphic leaf morphology. The plant can produce two types of leaves. Now here, the stem, there's two of these large bullate leaves adjoining, and right where they abut the stem, there's a tiny hole going in on either side. There are roots that go to the tree to cling to the tree when climbing, but there are also roots that go inside. Now let's look inside. Now, like the seed horns of a Stapeliad or Pachypodium, yes, it's in the same family, Apocynaceae or the Stapeliaceae. Anyway, there you are, Apocynaceae. However, if you look inside, this is not actually the fruit at all. There's the root going in through the little hole. You can see the root going into the bottom. And the odd part about it is this hole is intended to keep rain out. you would assume that rain would trickle in and the roots would be drinking the water that goes in, but no. The hole is constricted enough and positioned in a way that it keeps rain out. Instead, when the root goes in, what transpires in here is, first off, the plant has transpiration that occurs in hot sun. It sweats in here. Water will accumulate and trickle down to the bottom, and this plant's able to drink through all of summer, all year round. And in heavy thunderstorms and rainstorms or rainy conditions, other roots outside can be utilised, but this plant can continue to grow year round. Now, I found a plant that had been dead and shriveled and fallen from a tree on the ground. I cut open a bullate leaf, and even though it's got no moisture, it's no longer looking succulent. Let's go closer, and you can just see the ant there? There's an egg, there's some ants, and you can just see it there. There's an ant, there's another ant behind, and there's their eggs. They're nesting in there. They're hiding in there from the rain, the weather, the elements, from predators. These leaves can be quite large. You can see with a ruler. And this is a shriveled up one. There's no more moisture left in it. It's been sucked dry, but it's the only one I dared cut open because they're protected heavily by law again. Now, so I mentioned how there's two types of leaves, these bullate leaves and these leaves. Now, they could live in these houses. The ants could live in there and the plant's happy for years. And it can sit like this for years. And after a cyclone or big storm, some certain years, the tree grows taller and the canopy's higher or it's deeper shade. The plant's no longer happy where it's positioned on the tree. So it sends out this runner in search of a new location. And the new leaves, they travel along, and eventually when it reaches a location that's ideal, usually higher in the canopy, it'll then start growing these bullate leaves. Now, it's not juvenile leaves changing into these bigger leaves. These leaves stay at the size and the shape that you see developed here. It's actually a plant that can produce different kinds of leaves for different purposes. So, it's really quite a bizarre thing. So there you are. There's the plant. It's sending off these runners. When it finds the ideal location, it'll start growing the fully mature, the alternative leaf. Now, this is called Mount Tozar. This is in the Iron Range in the Cape York Peninsula. It's very remote. It's very isolated. I went in here with a team of keen hikers, all males that were ready to challenge the mountain, and we never got past about a third of the way up, a quarter of the way up. I'm not sure exactly, but anyway, it's really deep forest, jungle. Anyway, we did find this beautiful thing growing there. Oh, wow, a Hoya McGilverii, really beautiful. It is semi-succulent, and we found lots of strange things, carnivorous plants everywhere. There's Mount Tozar or the foothills, and there are ant plants everywhere, numerous species, but everything's to do with ants. These carnivorous plants are catching mainly ants. Hello, Michelle. A bibulus growing there, a nepenthes, little nepenthes. There are nepenthes everywhere. So carnivorous plants on the ground all over, climbing up into the trees and shrubs, nepenthes. It used to all be one species, but now I won't go into detail, but we've found there's actually many species in Australia. Up until the turn of the century, there'd only been one species, Nepenthes alata, but now it's been broken up into numerous species because they've found so many. These jugs primarily catch ants. Everything's to do with ants in this area. Ants, ants, ants. So these are also ant plants, but not ant house plants. These eat the ants. When you open up the lid of a new one, the liquid inside, it feels cold or cool to touch. But when you drink it, it kind of tastes a bit warm. Strange. And they climb up into the trees. In this location, I also found a really bizarre, strange thing. But anyway, all these plants have a really close association with the insects, especially the ants. Now, just quickly finishing off, I don't have too many more slides. I want to show some that don't quite clearly have names yet. So this is something kind of new and exciting that people would really want to have in their collection. Look at this. Look at the red petioles, the leaf stalks, and the white cortex at the base, and it's growing on the ground. It's actually rock under those leaves, rock face, rock surface. So, but anyway, it's got a name, tuberosa variety Salamanensis from the island. Oh, and what's that? This has no name. It's a new species. It's Australian and found in remote regions, and it's got cavernous holes at the base. What for? Diderot, one of Australia's leading authorities. I've travelled with him a few times into the Cape York and looking for a huge plant here down at, easy to grab size. It's beautiful, and a little one on the side, Discidia to the right, Diderot. He's travelled and he's found this thing too. This is relatively unknown, except for among some scientists. It's considered to be one of the most bizarre plants in the world. The name has changed, but this is what it was originally described as when it was first discovered. This plant has cavities that are positioned in an extraordinary arrangement, as if the plant deliberately has a design intended for certain creatures. What creatures? Anyway, Diderot managed to take this image with a telephoto lens. So thank you, Dig. This close up, you can just see it, but the structure of the plant in habitat is perhaps one of the most alien-looking plants on the planet. This has what appears to be matching opposing eyes. And the holes behind that develop are a centimetre or more in diameter, so up to half an inch, the opening. What kind of creatures are they inviting in? Wow, this is just bizarre. There is so much still to discover in remote far north Queensland, where few humans have yet reached. There are so many remote places, and it's so exciting. But this, one of my last plants I'll share with you, I found this at a location and I really enjoyed this thing. It's got a name. There it is there. It looks like a creature, an alien creature. And there it is in cultivation. It's quite a strange looking thing. And again, it's got a hollow for ants to live and travel along, like they use it as a highway to go from one place to the next. But this plant is just so cute. Michelle said she wanted one of these really bad. She said it's just so cute. Anyway, Lechinopsis sinuatus. It's just bizarre. When I found it, I was going to publish it in a book and tell and share it with everyone. The Australian government pleaded with me not to tell anyone where I found it. So I won't tell you where I found it. Humans are terrible, aren't they? Now, some of these plants grow easily in cultivation, very easily. In fact, just to show you a little bit more, this is in our house. This is one of Michelle's pets. And this is in our house. So there's a little seedling growing on the side of it. It's a monster. This plant is really quite large. It's bulging over the sides of its large bowl. And it's very happy in our house. In fact, these are Michelle's pictures. It's a fish tank full of myrmecophytes, myrmecodias, hydenophytums and whatnot. And one of Michelle's other pets, it's a bird that's free in the house, a cockatiel. Michelle was taking a picture primarily here of the cockatiel, but I'm sharing it with you because the ant plant behind just looks like a monster. They're her pets. Both of these are her two favourite pets. She put a coffee cup down to take this picture of cockatiel called Patty. Next to them, hydenophytum. Now, we take the hydenophytum occasionally out to shows and exhibits, and at our Cactus and Succulent Society annual show, this was positioned once in the middle of the table. There's Michelle's name at the bottom there, display plant. There's a lady there. Everyone wanted to stop and take a picture. They were so interested about this thing. But there's one lady in particular just wouldn't stop staring, and her head's shaking like she was about to explode or scream. I had a closer look and she's staring like, what an ugly looking, horrible plant, she's saying. She's saying, I don't know what she's thinking, but I looked at her and I thought, actually, do I know her? She looks like she's about to let a scream out. Hang on, I do know that face. Yes. Has anyone seen the movie The Blob Well, I've just about finished. None of these plants in this presentation are what you would consider pretty. None of these plants would be beautiful or edible or useful. In fact, garden-worthy at all, they're not. None of these are. They are more likely to creep some people out, like the lady. Yet an increasing majority of people are finding such plants as interesting, intriguing, entertaining, much like the famous Venus flytrap. As a succulent plant researcher and science communicator, I always contemplate the role that cacti and succulents can play in the wider public arena and promoting conservation. Now that more or less concludes, but just something perhaps, if I just a quick moment, this was this week. I was looking at local news magazine arrived in the mailbox and it says, community newsletter, our future is made in Australia. I often hear, I often hear of people who in our societies that talk about Madagascar and how Madagascar's being stripped of its forest and habitat and succulents are being robbed and everything is going to go to rack and ruin. Then I hear about the Amazon jungle that's being burnt down and cut down and all the good rare plants are being stolen and whatever, ubelmanias and whatnot. I hear about California, how the Dudleyas are being stripped from the coastal cliffs and beaches. And I think to myself, I hear of foreign places where, especially countries with poverty, where plants are being depleted and we frown upon what's going on over there. But I actually have a perspective which is rather interesting in that I do not think the problem is elsewhere over there in Madagascar or Africa or America. I think the problem is here at home, everywhere at home. See, humans intrinsically have a problem. And if we want to do something as an organization or as an individual, we have to perhaps be looking closer to home rather than blaming somebody else elsewhere. To promote conservation, we have to look at being less wasteful instead of filling our rivers and oceans with plastic. In the last 20 years, I've known since I was a child about what conservation is. I was educated through the education system about conservation, but I have to tell you, humans have become increasingly more hedonistic. And that is the biggest problem. If we were to address anything, it's use less plastic or pollute less or practice our conservation closer to home rather than judge those elsewhere in the world who are less fortunate. They do not have the opportunity to make a choice in Madagascar or Brazil. It's a life-threatening situation. They need to protect and preserve and feed their families. But here in Australia, I know for certain that we have all the things we need for survival, all the essential needs. We have surplus and we just waste it. We just tip it down the drain and into the rivers and into the ocean because we are human. Thank you all very much.